Hi, it's Bonnie, and we're here for our 5th class in basic quilting. This will be the last class. Today we're going to talk about how to assemble your quilt, how to quilt your quilt, and then how to finish your quilt. So if you have any questions, don't forget you can always go to the website at the library for quilting at clinton.lib.mi.us and ask any questions that you might have. So we're going to go ahead and get started. And we have talked so much about fabric and pressing. Today we're going to be assembling we're going to talk about quilting the quilt. Now, I have, and I'm going to try turning the camera here so that you can see, I have a variety of quilts that have been done differently. This is a quilt that I did several years ago. This one is done entirely by hand. There's absolutely no machine quilting on this quilt. If you look closely, you can see I hand quilted 1/4 of an inch all the way around each block by hand. I quilted it so that it would go all the way through to the backing fabric, and you can see the indentations there where my rows go through. Remember, you're going to want to quilt your quilt before you put the binding on the edge. Now, this is a binding that I cut, and I'll talk about that more in a minute. But what I had suggested earlier is to leave 2 to 3 inches all the way around your quilt with the backing so that you could do a roll backing sashing or border around the edge. Now, this is one that I made for when my boys were babies. And I took, this one I used a very fluffy batting because I wanted it to be light and airy. And I assembled my backing, my batting, and my front. And this one I had, again, I left it a couple of inches longer than the top and the batting, but I ended up in the long run cutting that off. This one I did use a commercial bias tape on. It was okay. I prefer the ones that I make myself. Now, before I assembled this quilt, I went around it and I did a hand embroidery stitch. It's called a blanket stitch all the way around. And that just goes through the applique and the top fabric. It does not go to the back. In order to hold the quilt together, I did little knots, and I'll demonstrate that in a few minutes. The knots go all the way through all 3 thicknesses. Remember, you do this before you put your binding on the outside. And you go all the way through, you make 2 stitches, and you leave the tails long enough to tie. I'll talk about that in a few minutes. Now, this is a quilt that my grandmother made for me when I was 10 years old. So that was the tradition with the grandchildren, that she would make them a crazy quilt when we were 10 years old. Now, this is made from fabric that was collected from all of the different aunts and sisters and nieces, and they were all scraps from clothing that we had made. Now, this was 50 some years ago. So that's a time when people made a lot of their own fabric or clothing. This was a dress that I had, I remember. This was an apron that my mother had. So yes, back in the day of aprons. And so a lot of these are also feed sacks. My grandmother had chickens, my dad had chickens and dairy cows, and a lot of the feed came in these beautiful pattern cloth sacks. And when the cloth sacks were empty, then you washed them and they ended up as dish towels or in quilts. So this is one she made. Now, as I look on the back, I see that she actually did some machine quilting to hold it in place. And then she came back and she did by hand all of this little cross stitch embroidery so that it decorated the quilt. To keep the quilt together though, she used the same little knots and they go all the way through. I think all she has in here is probably a sheet because this is not thick at all. Unfortunately, when I was a kid, I did not really know the value of the quilts that she had made. So this ended up being used outdoors in tents that we made. It probably made some tents. And so it shows a lot of wear. But remember, this is 50 some years old. And I see that the binding on the outside is almost all the way, in some places it is all the way through. So at some point I should take some stripping. I don't know if I would use purchased or probably by hand, and I would just flip that over and I would encase that raw edge into a nice binding, and that would make the quilt last a lot longer. So those are just some of the different kinds of finishing quilting. Now I'm going to take you down to the table. Now this is my block that I've been working on now for a while, and I'm just trying to figure out how to get you all in. And I have made now my sandwich quilt. I have my top piece, I have my batting, and I have my backing. Now remember, when you go to attach your backing, you're going to make sure that you line up the straight of the grain of that block with the straight of the grain of your backing fabric. And that way, again, they're going to have the same tension. When you go to sew them, they're going to pull the same amount from both directions because you have them lined up together. Again, you're going to want to do your surface quilting first. And let me show you about the tying the knot. I took a darning needle that has a sharp tip, and then I took embroidery floss, just regular embroidery floss. Embroidery floss has 6 little threads woven or wound together, and I separated them till I had 2 groups of 3 threads. So I threaded my needle with 3 of those embroidery threads, and this is what I'll do my knot with. And I'm going to do it here on this light fabric. Now, I would suggest that you do, if you're doing knots, do them at least every 6 inches. You can do them more. For this one, I would do one in the center to hold the corner, and then I would do maybe 2 here, and that's going to make my quilt stay together and keep its shape. Now, when you're quilting, you're going to start in the center of your quilt and you're going to work out. That way you're sure that your fabric isn't going to get too tight to do the center quilting. Now, as I said, as you quilt, you're going to use some of that backing fabric up. Every time you put a knot in, every time you do a quilting stitch, you pull some of that backing fabric up and it makes it both narrower and shorter. So that's another reason you need to leave that extra fabric all the way around. This one, just for an example, because this is just a small square, I just did leave about 2 inches. If I'm doing a large quilt, a bed-size quilt, I would probably leave 4 inches. You can always cut that extra off if you need to. Excuse me, but if it's too short to begin with and it starts to crawl back because you're stitching and it's pulling it back, then all of a sudden you don't have enough left around the edges to either catch in the binding or to use as your outside binding. So you might decide to do, as I did in the blue and pink quilt, hand stitching that goes, or machine stitching that goes 1/4 of an inch on either side of your seam line. That makes also a nice firm quilting, and you know that your backing and your batting and your top are going to stay together nicely. You might want to do what's called stitch in the ditch, and that's where you take on your sewing machine and you run machine stitching right in that seam where you connected your blocks. You hide it in there. And some people really like that style of quilting. I like to see the quilting stitches, so that's why I bring mine out away from that seam. Whether I'm hand quilting or machine quilting, I like to see the stitches. But stitching in the ditch also makes a nice firm anchor for that, for all 3 pieces to be together. Now, I have a lovely sewing machine that does many, many embroidery stitches. So I was thinking last night how fun it would be to do machine embroidery stitches across the seam line. Now I can do ducks, I can do bows, I can do stars. I have a really large variety of stitches I could choose from, and that might look really, really nice. And then you would also have that same pattern of quilting stitch on your backing fabric. It would anchor the 3 layers together. It would be very decorative. You could do it in the alike color so that it blends in. You could do it in a different, totally different color so you have a real contrast. You just have to decide which way you want your quilt to look. Do you want those stitches to stand out, or do you want them to blend back in? I'll be honest, I'm a blender. I like mine to blend in. I like them to be part of the quilt, but I don't want them to be the sole focus on the quilt. Except if I'm doing a holiday pattern. Maybe if I'm doing a quilting pattern, I might decide to do a gold metallic quilting. I could do gold metallic little snowflakes or Christmas bells. So you can just have so much fun deciding how you want to finish your quilt. So now I'm going to pretend, oh, I'm sorry, I forgot to show you that little tie stitch. Remember, you start quilting in the center of your quilt, and I can do this little tie, and I'm going to put my darning needle in, and I'm going through all 3 layers. And you can see here's my stitch, my needle showing right there. That's where my stitch is going to be. And so I went through all 3 layers, pull it through, and then I'm going to hold that end so it can't pull all the way through. And I'm going to take another stitch in exactly the same place. Again, making sure that I go through all 3 layers, and I'm going to pull that through. So now I have the end that I left, that I was hanging on to, and I have the end that's on my needle. So I'm going to snip the thread that's on the needle, and I'll just put it to the side. And I'll do another one of these on the light colored fabric in a second. And then I usually triple knot. So I'm going to make sure that I have left enough string that I can triple knot. If I leave too much, I can always clip it. Now, if I chose, this one I did green on green, so it's not going to show up. If I chose, I could have done purple on green. I could have done cream on green. So it all depends how you want your little knots to show up. So this is my center. So now I'll just come here and I'll do the same thing on this cream colored one. I took one stitch through all 3 layers. I'm going to hold that tail down, do another stitch right on top of the one that I just did, again holding that tail. There we go. So now we've gone through there. I'll clip it, and now I'll tie it, my 3 knots. And then you can decide if you do not want your tails on your knots to be so long, go ahead and clip them, but you don't clip them too close or the knot will come out and there won't be enough thread to redo that knot. Now that actually is a little longer than I would leave it, so I'm going to just clip a little bit off. And still there's a little tail there, but with use and with laundering, those are going to kind of roll up and they will be so much nicer. This one too, I'll clip, try and clip them all about the same length. And now I have 2 quilting knots done. So that's one way to do your quilting. If you wanted to do hand quilting, it takes a little longer. It looks very beautiful. You do have to learn though, and it will take practice, but by the time you're done, you'll be really good at it. You need to work at doing little tiny stitches. So again, you would start in the center and you would do your little tiny stitches right on the surface. So they make special quilting needles that are very fine, so they go through all 3 layers easily. They are sharp on the ends, so you're going to want to train yourself to use a thimble. And you use your thimble on your middle finger so that you have that to push the end of the needle through. Now, when you're first getting ready to start quilting, as I said, you start in the center of your quilt, and then you can decide whether you want to do pins or if you want to do basting. Basting is when you take a needle and a thread. You could do this on your machine or you could do it by hand, and you simply do a large stitch that goes through all 3 layers, and all that is for is to hold 3 layers together. You will eventually take that basting out, but you can pin, you can stitch, but you're going to need to hold those 3 layers together so that you don't end up with a bulge. It's really, really sad when you turn your quilt over and you haven't basted or pinned, and then all of a sudden you see in your backing fabric that you took some weird tucks because the fabric was folded, and then you end up having to take quilting out. And I think there's nothing sadder than having to take quilting stitches out after you've gone to all of that work. Sometimes when you're getting to the end of the quilt, and I will be honest, my fun in quilting is assembling the blocks. Then at that point, I really have to work at finishing the quilt. I probably right now have about 11 quilts that I have it all pieced, ready to assemble and put together. And I'll start another one so I can piece again. So the piecing is the fun part for me. So I just, you're going to have different things that you like and things that you don't like. So now I've got this backing fabric, and I'm going to show you one way that you could bind your quilt on the outside edge. Now, I talked about leaving some extra space. I see that my batting here is a little bit longer than my fabric. So I'm just going to take my scissors and I'm going to trim these off even. And I would not do this until the quilt is completely quilted, ready to be bound. Because again, as you stitch, that batting is going to be used up, the backing is going to be used up. Okay, so let's just take a look at this. So I've got at least 2 inches here, and this is a this is called rollover binding, and you take your fabric and you turn it so it's down even with the two layers, the top and the batting. You turn it down halfway and then you turn it over again. And this seals all three pieces together. And then you're going to want to pin it. At this point, it's going to be up to you if you're going to want to go to the sewing machine and stitch it, or if you're going to stitch it down by hand. It's really up to you. All right, so now you can see that this would be a very nice binding. Let me turn it so you can take a good look at it. There, and just look how easy that was. Now your quilt is going to be nicely bound. Now you'll have to decide how you want to do your corners. If you wanted to, you could just simply take and you could do the same thing on the other side. You could roll your edge in halfway and then flip it over, and you have a nice squared off corner. The edges would be even, nice squared off corner. Or you could take and you could miter this corner. Miter again is when you do that 45-degree angle. And let me just go ahead and let me just get this started. If you're doing a separate binding, you would do it similar. It's just a little different this way. So I'm going to go ahead and I'm going to just pin this binding down just a little ways, just so that you can get an idea of what the corner is going to look like. So we have this big glob of fabric here. And so what I would do, I would open it and I would cut off a chunk of that corner. Now, you aren't going to cut off too much. You're just going to cut off a chunk so that it's not so bulky in your corner. And then you can take and you can put one side down, and then you can bring the other side up. And this again is where you could trim off just a little bit. But I'm going to fiddle with it until I get that nice 45-degree angle coming from that corner out. And again, you're going to have to fiddle it with it just a little bit. Maybe for the first time out, you don't want to try a mitered corner. Maybe you're just going to want to go ahead and do this squared off corner, the black corner, and just go ahead and fold it so that they're even in a nice flat corner. Now, another way that you could finish your quilt is if you cut a bias binding strip. Now, this is one that I cut, and I cut on a 45-degree angle for the bias, and you see this has a lot of stretch to it, and that's why I cut it on the bias. That way you can easily trim it. So let's go ahead and let's unpin this. Okay, so let's, for a bias tape, whether you use a purchase tape or a self-made tape, after you have it all quilted, you are going to assemble all three pieces so they're even. Then for your bias tape, you have the two raw edges. You are going to fold your bias tape in two. And again, we have lots of stretch. And then you're going to take and attach the bias strip to the back of the quilt. Now, make sure I've got all three pieces here. I'm going to flip it so it is raw. Excuse me. I keep working out of my camera space. I'm going to flip it so that this is the raw edge. I'm going to come to the backing of the quilt. I'm going to attach the raw edge of the binding to the raw edge of the 3 quilt pieces. And let me pin some of this together so it holds it. This takes a little bit of time, and you can do the binding around the outside edge. You can do it in a similar color, a coordinating color, a contrasting color, any way that you want to do it. And I'll show you on my samples here in a second. Okay, so now I have taken all 3 pieces, and this, they call it a quilt sandwich. I guess it's kind of a silly name, but it's a fitting name. And then I would go to the sewing machine, or by hand, I would do my 1/4 of an inch seam all the way around. Now it's all anchored down and it's holding it together. Once I have done that, then I'll take the binding, and let me go down here. My quarter of an inch would be here. Then I can take my binding. I can flip the binding up and over those raw edges, and then I would put either by hand or by sewing machine, I would stitch down this binding on the right side. And yes, it will go through and you'll see it on the back. So again, you need to decide whether you want your stitching to show or to blend in. If you want it to show, leave your bobbin thread the same colors you're using on the top. If you don't want your stitching to sew, then use the color that matches your backing on the bobbin, and you would use your other thread on the top. With a regular home sewing machine, if you use the same brand of thread on both the top and the bottom, you shouldn't have to worry at all about the tension. And most home machines are they automatically censor, and they allow for that to happen, for the different weights of the thread. Thread can have a little bit different weight by the type of dye, even the color of dye that's used to dye that thread. It can change the tension of the thread, but most home machines aren't that exact, and they do self-adjust themselves enough you don't have to worry about it. So now you've got your binding all the way around. If you are going to do a regular blanket binding, a square binding like this one, you would sew your binding all the way to the edge, and then when you came back with your side strip, you would just go over the top, fold it right over the top. This is a purchase binding. Like I said, it's okay, and it's so much faster, and it's easy to use. It's already cut, it's already pre-folded. You sew along the little fold line that's on the bias tape. Again, practice with your bias tape. I can feel my batting. This was the first time I had used the bias tape like this for a quilt. And I can feel that my batting only comes about this far up. And then this whole part of the bias, or the binding here, the bias binding, is not, there's nothing in it. It's empty. So it's really thin. Now, as I'm sitting here looking in the camera, I could very easily take that binding I have on there, fold it down. It would be much thinner, narrower, but it would give a more solid binding. I might have to do that. And the corner is very simple corner to do. If you're going to miter a corner, that takes a little more thinking to do. I know that when my grandmother did this quilt, she did miter the corners. She didn't do a real exact job. I don't know how she made it work out. Look how wide this side of the border is and how narrow this side is. Somehow she figured it out, and she went ahead and she took the two pieces. She cut the edges at the 45-degree angle, and then she sewed it by sewing machine first, and then she came back with the decorative stitching on the corners. The decorative stitching only shows on the back at the corners. Otherwise, when she did the decorative, oh, a stain, something from when I was a kid, I'm sure. Otherwise, her decorative stitching does not show, but her little knots show. So a nice mitered corner is also a good option. Now, this is a binding that I cut on this quilt, and it's a very narrow binding. But again, I did the mitered corner. My mitered corner isn't real sharp. Again, they take a little practice to do to get that nice sharp corner. I'm sure that I sewed up here and I sewed up here and I left part open so that then I could fold them one under the other to get the correct angle. And I probably didn't leave enough fabric, and that's why it kind of has a rounded edge instead of a nice pointed edge. Is anybody going to know but me? Nope. Well, now you guys do because I told you. So there's so many different ways that you can finish a quilt. You just have to make sure that your backing for your quilt goes in the same direction as your quilt blocks do. So you want to match up the grains of your fabric. And that way, as you're putting your bindings on, your pieces will react in the same way. If you were to put your backing on cross grain versus straight of the grain, you might get a lot of stretching on your backing fabric. And then you're going to end up with different widths, and you could get puckers on the back, and you certainly don't want puckers on the back. You start in the center of your work and you work out. And so what I do when I do a big quilt, I start in the center, I work out maybe 12 inches to the side, and then I work 12 inches to the top, and then I go to the next section and I go out another 12 inches all the way around, and that way I'm getting the same amount of pull on both the top, the batting, and the backing. I would suggest that for this first time out that you go ahead and leave your backing fabric longer, so that all you have to do for your binding is to turn it over. Look how nice and neat that is, how easy that is to do. For your first time doing a corner, I would say that you square off those corners. Make it easy on yourself. You don't want to, your first time out especially, you don't want to make yourself hate that quilt because it was so complicated. The whole point of quilting is for fun, and it's really a great meditation kind of work because you concentrate so hard on this that you kind of let the rest of the world go by. So now I have turned that under. I'm going to come to my corner. I'm going to turn this halfway, just like I just did. And then I'll flip it all the way over. I'll make sure that the two sides are even. And you're going to be very pleased. You'll have a nice square corner that will look all pretty and even. And to me, this looks just as nice as a mitered corner, and it's not nearly as much work. You're going to want to make sure that you have those nice and even so that you turned it under the same amount here as you did here, and then you're going to have a nice square corner that will go down. So if you have any questions, please go ahead and contact me at the library with this quilting address. If not, give the library a call. I'm there all day on Tuesdays. That's the day that I'm there all day, or all day on Saturdays. You can always call if you have a question, or just go ahead and do this web address. So it's been a lot of fun working with you. We started this back in May when we could all still be together at the library. And then I just tried to continue so you could continue making your quilt and finish your quilt. I hope that when this COVID is over and we can open up again, we'll have another quilting class in person. And then if you have questions, you can bring it in and we can work together. So enjoy your quilting, have fun with your quilting. It's a great way just to get lost in your thinking and your planning. Probably quilting was the one thing that saved me during the big COVID shutdown. I have one quilt that I did. I'm ready to take it to the quilters. I'm going to have it professionally quilted. And that was like my saving thing because I sat every day and I cut blocks and I did every stitch by hand. So its title is COVID-19. I lots of times name my quilts. That's a fun thing to do. Maybe you are dedicating it to a person, living or dead, and it means something to you. Maybe you're using someone's favorite color or favorite quilt design, and you can just have a lot of fun. Quilts become very, very personal, and you really become attached to them. I have made quilts now for my children and my grandchildren, and sometimes it's hard to give those quilts away, but you do, and you know that they're going to love them and take care of them. And because they have watched me throughout the years create these, they know what a lot of work they have been, and so they really appreciate it when I do give them a quilt that I have done. So thanks so much for watching and listening. If you have any questions, let me know. Otherwise, happy quilting.